Israel is having a war with a very distant country. This is not something that we are used to. The potential for regime change is still there. The Biden administration, and I think Democrats in general in the United States today feel less comfortable with the general idea of the use of force.
Hi, it's Jennifer Jacobs, and I'm filling in once again for Jacob Lasnik on The Deep Dive. I'm recording this episode on Passover Eve, the 1st of April. We are more than 1 month in to Operation Roaring Lion. Each week, we've made sure to bring you the top stories, and this week, because it is Passover, we're going to be doing something a little bit different, but going back sort of to the regular format of The Deep Dive, which is exciting. I had the privilege of sitting down with researcher and columnist Shmuel Rosner to talk about some of the main points of this war, especially after the 15-point peace plan that Trump offered to Iran. We talk about the Strait of Hormuz, rockets from Lebanon, and the latest updates up until now. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Shmuel Rosner, and we are wishing you all from the Jerusalem Post a very, very happy Passover. Shmuel, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
For our viewers who maybe haven't heard of you before, can you just introduce yourself a little bit before we get started?
I'm a writer, editor, researcher, a senior fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute, JPPI, and the editor of an Israeli data journalism website, mandat.com.
So let's talk about the current situation. It's hard to ignore. You've been watching Israeli security policy for a very long time. Does this moment with Iran feel new to you, or is it a crisis that's just sort of been bubbling up and is expected?
No, this is something new. This is not something we saw in Israel's history. Both there are several aspects that are unique to this time when we look at previous wars or previous security crises. So one is that Israel is having a war with a very distant country. This is not something that we are used to. You know, Israel fought against Syria and Egypt and against terrorism in the Palestinian territories. But fighting against a faraway country, that's something what we didn't see in such large manner before. The type of cooperation and coordination with the United States is certainly something new. Israel was assisted by the U.S. in previous rounds. We got ammunition from the United States and diplomatic support and cover. But never before Israeli, Air Force pilots alongside American pilots were, operating in such close quarters ever before. So these are things that are new to the scene.
What does that mean exactly in the sense of, this kind of unprecedented cooperation and having a war that's not, necessarily on our borders? Do you have, I guess, like a look to the future on how this is going to play out? And I know that's a hard question to answer because it's very difficult to know.
Yeah, the options are many. It can go from total victory. What does total victory means? Total victory means basically one of two things: regime change in Iran, whether this is something that happens immediately or after a while after the actual war is ended. If we see regime change in Iran, that's a clear achievement, both for President Trump, for Prime Minister Netanyahu, for the two countries. Getting rid of an arch enemy of the two countries, that's something that will be considered as an achievement. As a secondary achievement, you can count the getting out of enriched uranium from Iran. We do know that the infrastructure for building nuclear bomb was in many ways destroyed in Iran or gravely eroded in Iran. But we also know that Iran is still in possession of enriched uranium, and getting this out of the country will also be considered great victory for the two countries. So these are the two positive possibilities. The less positive possibilities are for Iran, for the regime to survive, for the enriched uranium to stay in Iran, and for Iran to even have some claim over the Strait of Hormuz and to be able to exert more influence on the region, on the immediate region, and on faraway countries. If Hezbollah stays, if Hamas survives, if Iran survives, if Iran is able to reestablish its military infrastructure and keep intact its enriched uranium, then we see an Iran that is not necessarily weakened, and in some aspects it can be even emboldened, just because of the mere fact that it was able to withstand an attack from the main superpower in the world, and survive.
I guess that brings me to my next question in the sense of last week. We were talking a little bit, especially like in JPost and the videos that we were making, we've been talking a lot about how there's also been a little bit of conflicting goals seeming to be coming out from the Israeli side and the American side, and not necessarily in a way that's so obvious. But for example, talking about Trump's peace plan and Israel not necessarily talking about the peace plan, and then having Iran's response and all those kinds of things. There's From the beginning of the war, there's felt like there's been a little bit of a gap, especially because also people in the US maybe don't support the war as much as uh, maybe it would have been hopeful, or maybe it's harder to understand having a war that's overseas and something that's less a direct threat, as that's how people are assessing it. Where do you think this gap sort of comes from? Because on the one hand, we have like very similar goals and we're working together very, very closely. And then when you kind of look at it and assess it, there are some things where, there are question marks.
Well, I think the gap is to be expected. The people who make a big deal out of the gap as if this is something that should never be should never manifest itself in such relations. That's a naive perspective on such war. The United States is looking at the world from the perspective of the main superpower and the leader of the Western world. Israel is looking at the same conflict with similar eyes, but from a very different perspective. We are a much smaller country, maybe a regional power, but certainly not a global superpower. We have the interests of Israel are much more narrow than the interest of the United States. That's on the one hand. And on the other hand, for Israel, the war is much more essential and dramatic than it is for the United States. So to see these two countries operating together with such, great coordination and cooperation, even though we look at the scenes from different perspectives, I'd say that it is surprising how close we are, and not at all surprising that there are some narrow gaps between the strategy and the outlook of the two countries.
It's interesting that you say that, because I think that when you say it out loud, it makes so much sense, in the sense of course, two different countries, two different goals. Maybe the end goal is similar, but the reason and the interests of both countries are very different. And I think you can't expect two countries who live in such different spaces with such different threats to be coming in with the exact same mindset. So it is interesting.
I
think
agree.
a lot of times,
Yes, I agree.
a lot of times people like to portray it, and it might be just to kind of create buzz and to be like, well, Israel and the US are not getting along and things like that. So it's actually nice to hear a different, more refreshing
Look,
perspective.
I don't want to sugarcoat everything. At some point, these differences can become meaningful, in the sense that the United States decides that it's time to end the conflict, and Israel feels that it's not yet the time, or vice versa. But by and large, some gaps are to be expected, and the surprising, and even pleasantly surprising and dramatically surprising thing is to see the very close cooperation between these two countries, even though they look at the region from different perspectives.
Obviously, this is a very different relationship than the Biden administration was, especially Biden being president right after October 7th. I think a lot of people didn't have necessarily the confidence that Washington would have Israel's back. Do you think that now that Trump is, first of all, president, second of all, sort of showing that in a way, our goals are aligned. Do you think that the people have trust in Washington to stay with Israel?
Well, Israelis do have much more confidence in the Trump administration than they did in the Biden administration. Although I think that, the Biden administration does deserve a lot of credit for standing for Israel and assisting Israel and expressing its support for Israel in the days and months after October 7th. I think that some people tend to portray the past in bleaker terms than they deserve. There were differences between the Biden administration and the Israeli government, but the Biden administration, by and large, supported the war effort of Israel. However, the Biden administration, and I think Democrats in general in the United States today, feel less comfortable with the general idea of the use of force. They tend to think that the use of force is problematic in and of itself. And for Israel, at this stage, it is much more comfortable to have to deal with a president that is comfortable with the use of force, that does feel that under certain circumstances, the use of force is inevitable and possibly the only remedy to resolve a problem. So I think one of the reasons for which Israel is getting along with President Trump better than it did with President Biden is for that reason. President Trump does not feel uncomfortable when a problem presents itself and the obvious solution to the problem is to just send in the Air Force. He lets Israel do it. He's doing it himself. And that's something that for Israel right now is almost essential.
If we go back to one of the scenarios you mentioned before, because obviously there are a few different outcomes that could be from this war. If Iran does survive this conflict and they do end up crossing the nuclear threshold, what do you think Israel's realistic options are? And from a public perspective, what are the kinds of things that they support? Because at that point, it will get to the point, I believe, even more so than now, people will be stressed about survival. And I think once that becomes the question about core survival, it makes people very quick to act. So how do you see that playing out?
Well, if Iran acquires a nuclear weapon, that's a very dangerous situation for Israel, for the Middle East, and for the world. This will clearly ignite a nuclear arms race in the whole region. Iran will not be the only country to possess nuclear weapons in the Middle East. Other countries are going to acquire similar means almost immediately. And this will become, it'll be a very close call for us having a nuclear war in the region that could spread to the rest of the world. It is a situation that I think all people understand is undesirable. There was never an American administration who wanted Iran to possess nuclear weapons. All American administrations were fiercely objected to the idea of Iran having a nuclear weapon. The only differences between administrations are differences about the means necessary to prevent Iran from getting to such point. The current administration seems much more in line with Israel in the sense that it accepts the tendency of Israel to argue that there is no way other than military means and regime change in Iran if we want to prevent a future in which Iran will possess nuclear weapons.
And what do you say in the sense of what the action may be, if that may be part of it? What kind of response would then be, in Israel's eyes, proportionate?
What, if Iran does possess nuclear weapons?
Yeah.
I think Israel is going to do as much as it can to prevent it from happening. If it happens, then it happens. It's a new situation, and Israel will have to deal with it. Whether this means, building more shelters or possessing more countermeasures that could threaten Iran. Everything is on the table. But again, I think we all want to avoid such a situation because this will be very dangerous for Israel, for Iran, for the Middle East, and for the world.
Iran's strategy has been for a long time proxies. And in a way, it's been very effective. Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis. And my question is, after the last 2 years, with the network being weakened, how does it change the setup now? Because it looks different. The way that Iran can sort of show power is different.
Well, it changed the calculation for Israel dramatically. A decision to attack in Iran, was much more complicated when Hezbollah was still very much in power in Lebanon. And as you can see, since the major attack of Israel on Hezbollah back in the fall of 24, Israel feels much freer to operate against Iran directly without the fear of being bombarded by Hezbollah from the north. Now, this doesn't mean that Hezbollah no longer has any power to harass Israel and occupy its forces in this back and forth exchanges of fire. Some people thought after the fall of 24 that Hezbollah no longer exists. That was because of politicians, as they tend to do, oversold the achievement of the IDF. Nevertheless, Hezbollah is dramatically weakened in the north, and for Israel, this means much more room for maneuver in the Middle East without the fear of having to deal with, hundreds or thousands of casualties because of a Hezbollah attack, as the IDF assumed was going to be the case before Israel was able to cripple and erode the power of Hezbollah.
A question that kind of always sits with me, and I'd love to get your take on it, and it's a little bit moving away from what we're talking about now, but in the sense of Hezbollah and how strong the effect their involvement in October 7th could have been, I find it very interesting how, they sort of joined the next day. And it wasn't something that was coordinated in the sense that could have been so much worse. And when we think about like the arm of Iran and how it could have extended, I just wonder why, maybe it's miraculous or maybe it's, something else, but why that wasn't coordinated in that way, because in the end, it ended up crippling Hezbollah in many more ways than I think people expected.
Well, I think the Hamas probably wanted and hoped that Hezbollah will join in when its own attack, when Hamas attack proved to be successful from their point of view. This did not happen for a variety of reasons. Whether that was a miracle, I don't much believe in miracles. I think it was a decision made by the leaders of Hezbollah and Iran not to get involved in a war that they did not initiate, and that wasn't necessarily the right war at the right time for them. Ultimately, this played well for Israel. Had Israel had to face both an attack from Hamas and Hezbollah at the same time, we should assume that the butchery and the calamity would have been much greater. I don't think Israel was, I don't think there is a scenario in which Hezbollah and Hamas in coordination could defeat Israel, but the cost would have been much higher, and the whole thing would play out in a different way. What if games are always interesting, but assessing, what would happen had Hezbollah invaded Israel on October 7th? That's, your guess is as good as mine.
What would you say the proxy groups would then look like if the scenario ends up being, a regime change in Iran?
Oh, if there's regime change in Iran, these proxies are going to be in great trouble. Uh, Without the life support of Iran, without the backing of Iran, uh, it's quite probable that these groups are going to be much weakened. When it comes to the Houthis in Yemen, that's a more complicated story. When it comes to Hezbollah in Lebanon, I think this will embolden the Lebanese government to operate against Hezbollah, maybe supported by the United States or France or Israel and other countries. I think this will put Hezbollah back in place. Shiite resistance in the region is not going to disappear in one day. So I don't think that all things are going to be just roses after regime change in Iran. But the power of these groups that are supported by Iran is only there if they have the backing of a major power. Without such backing, they are exposed to attacks from different powers in the region, and I don't think their ability to have huge impact on future events is going to be dramatic.
So you comment on Khan News daily, and you are always reading the room in the sense of, what is happening. What do you think the Israeli public are getting right about Iran that the international media keeps missing? And I find that it's an interesting question also because, I work for Jerusalem Post. There's a lot of discrepancies sometimes between different outlets, different reporting. So I'd love to get your take on that.
Well, I think Israelis understand much better than the rest of the world how dangerous Iran could be, not just for Israel, but for the rest of the region. Israelis are much more educated on these issues because it is an issue that's essential for their lives. And that's why there are much better judges of Iran's behavior and abilities and danger than people who live outside of Israel or outside of this region and do not understand how an emboldened Iran could have impact on the lives not just of neighbors in proximity to Iran, but also other countries all around the world. This is something Israelis understand better. It doesn't mean that they understand everything better. There are some things that Israelis don't understand. Israelis, for example, don't understand the importance of the Strait of Hormuz. This is something. It's not a coincidence that Israelis look at Iran's nuclear capabilities as the most crucial issue, and from Washington, the Strait of Hormuz seems much more important. This is what we were talking about earlier: the viewpoint of the regional power and the viewpoint of the global superpower. The global superpower must take care of commercial routes all around the world, including the Strait of Hormuz. For Israel, whether Saudi ships can or cannot move through the straits, that's not for us to worry about. We have to worry about Iran being strong enough to harm Israel and to exert its influence all over the region. And that's why Israelis are much more focused on the interests that are of great concern for Israel. And, we let other people worry about other things connected with this conflict.
Would you say, I guess, just on a gut level, if I can ask you, are you optimistic or pessimistic about how you see this unfolding? And by this, I mean, the war itself.
Well, it really depends on the hour of the day. The power and the potential is still there to achieve great things in this war. But to achieve great things, you need a plan, you need determination, and you need patience. People who expect all wars to be like the Six-Day War and to end after a very short period of time with complete victory, these people can become quickly disillusioned by the difficulties of war. I think the potential for regime change is still there. I think the potential for getting the enriched uranium out of Iran is still there. I think the potential for a much weakened Iran is still there. Whether Israel is going to have the patience, and more importantly, whether the United States is going to have the patience to get it through, that's an open question that I cannot answer. It's all in the head of basically one leader, and maybe for him it also depends on the time of day, on whether he wants to continue or looks for a way out.
Before we wrap up, I want to just touch a little bit on Trump's peace plan, because it was really something that was kind of screaming in the headlines, especially at the end of last week. Obviously, there were, I guess, demands or requirements from the United States side, and Iran sort of came back with a rebuttal of sorts, almost kind of saying, well, if this is the case, then, the United States are not going to be, you can't have bases in the Gulf and, things like that, that are just the things that neither side are going to agree to. And, in any sense of, I feel like if that happened, everyone would be incredibly surprised. That in itself would be like incredibly unprecedented. So what do you think the purpose of doing that was? Because it's hard to sort of understand. And I'm talking about from the United States point of view. Was it, do you think, in your opinion, more something of like a gesture, even though you know that it's not going to be something that's actually going to be taken seriously? Or was it genuinely a moment of, hey, we don't want to be part of this anymore?
No, I think it was probably an attempt by President Trump to show that he is willing to end the conflict if the other side is willing to accept some terms that he can set. He doesn't want to be seen as someone who wants war. So he needed to put together some type of plan to say, well, I'm not interested in war. I'm interested in peace, as long as the other side is willing to give up on some things that are, that it should obviously give up on. If they say they don't want nuclear weapons, they don't need enriched uranium within their territory. Let them hand it to an international power that can deal with the uranium and eliminate it. President Trump wants to show both the American public and the rest of the world that there are terms under which he's willing to end the war, short of regime change. That it's not essential for him to want to eliminate the current regime. If the regime wants to save itself from elimination, here's the offer that can be viable and implementable for their use. If the Iranians aren't willing to give up on even the most basic things that the United States believe it must give up on, then there will be no peace and the war must continue.
And finally, I just want to ask you a little bit more from the Israeli public perspective. What do you see in the sense of, I guess, also your work with JPPI and just in general, for the Israeli public? What is the general feeling right now? We're a month into this war. What are you seeing?
Well, first of all, the war was very popular among Israelis. Most Israelis supported the attack on Iran. Most Israelis understand the need for such attack. Some Israelis are somewhat disappointed by the current state of affairs, and they don't think that Israel has a good plan for moving forward and achieving its initial goals. Again, some of it is because of politics, because when you have politicians that the public doesn't trust, and these politicians are trying to oversell their ability to achieve certain things, this erodes the trust of people in the general conduct of the war. But by and large, I think the Israeli public is still supportive of the attack and is hopeful that the United States is going to stay the course. I think the main concern of Israelis is for the United States not to stay the course, and in such case, for Israel to be left alone with a war that is somewhat unended. Hezbollah empowered, Iran possibly somewhat empowered. That's not a good outcome for Israel. So because of this fear, some Israelis are, you can see signs of apprehension among some Israelis, but support in general for the idea of launching such war against Iran, support for regime change in Iran, support for wanting to get the uranium out of Iran, that's still overwhelming among Israelis.
Well, Shmuel Rosner, thank you so much for giving us your insights. And I say this at the end of most of my interviews that we're talking about Iran. I hope the war will be over soon, but also we have to be realistic, and time will tell. But in the meantime, I hope we'll stay safe, and we look forward to having you on again soon.
It was my pleasure. For victory and peace. That's all we want.
That is it for today's episode. Thank you so much for joining us. And once again, we wish you a very happy Passover and a peaceful time ahead. For more news, analysis, and the latest updates, make sure to head to jpost.com.